Democrats, the DNC, we're reporting today at Bloomberg, is now moving up potentially the nomination, the official nomination of Joe Biden to shut this down and, in fact, make him the official nominee as early as July 21st. What do you make of this moment for the Democratic Party?
Well, if I were the Democratic National Committee, or if I were the Biden campaign, I would certainly want to move it up too and shorten the game as much as I could. But, there's just an enormous amount of nervousness in the Democratic Party. But the thing is, they like Joe Biden. They don't want to be seen as undercutting him, but there's a very strong feeling that he needs to get out of the race. But there's just a real reticence for people to for prominent people in the party to publicly come out and to, offend somebody that they like, they respect, that they tend to agree with. But they are really, really nervous.
Well, and potentially you get more nervous if you see a precipitous drop in polling for Joe Biden. That's something we spoke about earlier today with Jane Hall of American University, who told us this.
They're probably going to wait for the polls and see what is the polling on this. What does the so-called average voter think? Is the damage from seeing these bites replayed in the split screen that many people were shocked by? I think even Biden's supporters. Is that the measure of the man, or can they reframe it? What should they be doing to put him out there?
And Charlie, we're starting to get a trickle of some polling that could be troubling for the Biden campaign, including a St. Anselm survey in New Hampshire that just came out after the debate finds Trump leading 44-42. Yes, that's within the margin of error. But last time they did this poll back in December, Biden was up 10 points. That's a 12-point swing, Charlie. Is that the kind of polling we're talking about that could have sway on whether he remains the nominee?
Well, I don't doubt that it swung a lot in New Hampshire over, since last December. But I think that it's how do you read a very close reading? If you're just looking at the ballot test, I don't think you're going to see as much movement as a lot of people expect, because I don't think there are going to be people that were planning on voting for Joe Biden and now they're going to vote for Trump. The danger for Democrats is people that want, they're Democrats, and they were already not enthusiastic about this election, just becoming completely demoralized and not voting at all. And that's sort of I think the biggest danger for Democrats. The Biden campaign is circulating now a poll they did over the weekend from Hart Research that showed that the ballot test basically didn't move, that Trump was still up by a couple points like he was a month ago. And that may well be. But again, it's about a demoralized party that could not just lose the presidency, because President Biden was already in tough shape there, but cost him any chance of getting the House back and maybe making the difference between losing a seat or two in the Senate and losing, 4, 5, or 6.
I wonder your thoughts on the vice president in this case, Charlie. By midnight last Thursday, we were hearing the names Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer. What does this say about America's perceptions of Vice President Kamala Harris when she's not the first person that people are turning to right now?
Yeah, the thing is, there's no shortage of talent or ambition in the Democratic Party. She was kind of a chancy choice for Biden because she ran for president the same time he did in 2020. Her campaign didn't do very well. She didn't make it to the first primaries and caucuses. And quite frankly, the American people have just not warmed up to her. And so I don't know that she would run any better than Biden does, and that Democrats would be better off if they just went to somebody else. But I think you could find 2 dozen, 3 dozen current or recent Democratic cabinet members, governors, senators who would run far stronger against former President Trump. And just one more point, that remember the old joke about the 2 guys that were getting chased by an angry bear. And they did, you didn't have to run faster than the bear. You just had to run faster than the other guy. All someone would have to do is beat Trump, who has he along with Biden have the highest negatives of any political figures in the country. So, they may not be able to beat any other Republican, but if they can beat Trump and he has the nomination locked up, Democrats would be better off.
Well, as we talk about Donald Trump, Charlie, he, of course, was dealt a partial victory by the Supreme Court today, ruling that he has at least some immunity from prosecution for official acts as president. I won't ask you to weigh in on the extent that that was a legal win for him. But what about politically? What does it do?
Yes, I'm glad you asked it that way because I'm not a lawyer. So the thing is, I think anything that shows sort of the magnitude of what Trump was able, if you're a Democrat, the magnitude of what Trump was able to do for 4 years and what he could do for another 4 years, I think it just sort of raises the heat, the anxiety of, oh gosh, if we nominate Biden, he was probably going to lose. He was more likely going to lose before the debate, and certainly looks worse now of how bad that would be. So to me, it just sort of underscores for Democrats the stakes here that, Biden was, I was giving him about a 1 in 3 chance before the debate. And now, it's certainly longer odds than that. Democrats, it's a soul searching time. They don't want to hurt him. They like him. But at the same time, boy, they don't want to go down. They shouldn't want to go down with the ship.
Well, that says a lot coming from Charlie Cook. Charlie, we've had people come on this program since Thursday and say that Joe Biden lost the election on Thursday night. Do you agree?
No, the thing is, in the electoral, a Democrat probably needs to win the national popular vote by 3 or 4 percentage points. And he was even at best nationally because Democrats waste a lot of votes running up the score in California, New York, and Illinois, and Maryland, and Massachusetts, and places like that. Because, once you win a state by 1 vote, anything above that's wasted. You win California by 5 million votes or New York by 2 million votes. That's 7 million votes right there that don't count. In terms of affecting the outcome of the race. So there was a real strong tilt against Biden to begin with, and this just made a bad situation for Democrats even worse.